Hey, I'm Micah Rich, founder of the League of Movable Type, the first open source font foundry. I'm here today to teach you some of the foundations of designing with type, and we started our journey to learning some of those design fundamentals in our last video with one of the most crucial questions you could start with. Why is type so important, and why should it matter to you? Now, in case you didn't get the intro from the first video, I've been a designer for 10 plus years. I started the League back in 2009, publishing some of the most widely used open source fonts out there. And I started a design agency when I first got out of college, where we ended up working with a handful of well-known clients like NBC, Mozilla, Discovery Channel. Even got featured in magazines like .NET Magazine, Eight Faces, and had some of our work featured in the App Store a couple times. I've been working with and teaching typography for years. And typography arguably has one of the biggest impacts in the way people see your work and what you put out in the world, whether it's good or bad. And my goal in teaching is to help you level up your design work, whether you're a beginner or even a total non-designer. Good design is based on good typography. Helps you build trust, make the right impression, ultimately can help make or break how beautiful and functional something you're putting out there is. Okay, now I have to say the response to the first video was amazing, so thank you to the hundreds of people who watched, and especially if you were one of the people who wrote in with comments and questions. I love you guys. Design exists because of the community that we build around it, and I love that we're getting to build something like that together, even if it's just in this little series. So I mentioned in the last one of the most asked questions I get all the time is, how do you tell what makes a good font? How can I tell when a typeface is quality? And there's a lot to cover here, and we're about to dive into some solid stuff today, but we definitely can't hit every point. That's kind of what the upcoming course is all about, getting in depth on things like this, how to pick the right fonts, how to pair them together. But there are some really simple points I think I can help with today to get you analyzing fonts right away. We're going to talk about three of them, but before we dive in, there's one important term that I think is always good to clarify. And if at any point in this video I end up using a word or a phrase or something that's not familiar to you, it's perfectly fine. There's no shame in it. Reach out and ask me what it means. But there's one important thing, so we're all on a good page to start together. The difference between a font and a typeface. I get this question a lot, especially from friends who aren't as nerdy about type as some of us are. But the answer is simple. A typeface is a design for some letters. It's the creative idea for how a designer wants to illustrate the letters. That's it. It's the concept, the drawing of it. A font is the piece of software you install on your computer that lets you actually use those drawings in your own design. A type designer will come up with his or her idea of how the letter should look, sometimes drawing on paper, then moving to the computer, and other times just starting right in the computer. They'll take those drawings and, using a font editor, package all that up into the OTF or TTF files you're probably used to installing on your machine. The typeface is the idea, the font is the computer file. And honestly, in a lot of conversation, we all kind of use these terms interchangeably, which is fine. So if anyone gives you trouble and starts getting all haughty about the difference between one or the other, tell them you watch this, send them to me. And now that that's out of the way, let's talk about the three important qualities you should pay attention to when figuring out the quality of a font. The first important quality of a good font is line quality. Obviously, fonts are all drawn with lines, but the precision and intention that those lines are drawn with has a huge effect on the quality and usefulness of a font. Let's see a quick example. Now, while these fonts are totally different personalities, it's a perfect example to demonstrate the differences in how lines are drawn. Now, the one on the right, it's actually one of my favorite fonts. Tons of antique personality, really beautiful font. One of the goals of a type designer is to get the feeling of the font across using as few extraneous points as possible. The more points, the more little kinks and creases you might see, especially when you start using it in really large sizes. That doesn't mean the font on the right is bad, but it does tell you where using it might break. And that's what we want to know when we're judging the quality of the fonts we want to use. Takes a little practice, but as you start looking at either the fonts you already have or new fonts you might choose, zoom in, take a second to really look at how the lines are drawn, especially in a lot of quickly scanned and converted fonts, like when someone is turning their handwriting into a font, you'll see a lot of little points. And once you start noticing, you can start making a more educated decision on whether this can be a big and featured font or whether you can get away with using it because it's tiny, secondary, that sort of thing. That's a lot of the point, actually, that I want to get across here. The whole good versus bad font thing is bull. It's black and white. It's not black and white. You can use a poorly drawn font to good effect by knowing its limitations and working around them. There's no objectively good fonts, and that's ultimately a deeper lesson here. Limitation breeds creativity. Don't think in terms of perfect. Think, how can I work with this? Okay, now the second important quality of a good font is texture, sometimes described as color. The similarity between letters and the space letters take up in a box. This really affects your visual flow of your eye as you're reading through the text, whether your eye jumps up and down as you read or stays steady, which, believe it or not, can honestly subconsciously exhaust someone reading it. So let's check out an example so you can see a little bit of what I mean. You can start to understand this a little bit better by writing a quick sentence and imagine an invisible box around each letter, actually called a bounding box. Type designers use this when designing fonts. Make sure they don't clip by jumping outside of the box, and make sure there's some consistency to the space each character takes up, including the space between characters. The negative space is as important as the positive space. And the more consistent it looks and feels, the easier it is to read, which ultimately is the point. And the best way to test for this sort of thing is by looking at a slightly longer piece of text, at least a sentence, if not a paragraph. And one trick that's sometimes helpful is to literally squint your eyes so you're not really able to read the text, but you sort of start seeing patches of black, white, and gray. Watch to see how much your eyes have to work to scan the text without really reading, and whether you notice any giant weird gaps that jump out. If, when you squint, the whole thing seems like a relatively neutral blob of color, you're in decent shape. If you notice big old globs of black and white between the letters, you might want to keep hunting for a font that'll be less taxing on your readers in this situation. Of course, this matters way more for body text, where there's long passages of type and paragraphs, so keep that in mind too. The bigger it is that you're using the font, like a giant headline or a poster, the less the texture of the words next to each other will matter, because there's literally just less for someone to read. Okay, now the third important quality of a quality font, the last point for today, just because I know we can't spend all day together, is straight up completeness. Now, not every font is going to have every character, weight, and style you ever dream of. I've got a strong belief that that is perfectly okay. Fonts are tools. There's nothing wrong with a type designer making a tool that is intended to be used for a singular purpose. But more importantly, and often overlooked by both new and experienced designers, is that you aren't going to need a complete font in every situation. In fact, I would argue it's pretty rare. But completeness is a thing you can use to judge whether a font fits for a particular usage or not. So here's a handful of questions you can ask yourself as you're about to pick fonts for an important project. What languages does it cover? And more important, what languages do you need? If you're writing something that'll only ever be in English, who cares if it has extra characters that make it work with French or Greek or Russian? It won't affect you, and that opens up a lot of potential font choices by not needing it. What type of text are you actually setting? Do you need this font just for headlines? Maybe you don't even need lowercase because it's something you'll end up setting in all caps. There are a lot of super cool display fonts with only uppercase that you can successfully use, ones that otherwise people might not consider good enough because they weren't objectively complete. But alternatively, if you're writing like long body text, you might want to look for a family, a font that comes with multiple styles and weights that are designed to work together. The major 4 styles for setting body text are regular, italic, bold, and bold italic, which covers 80% or more of the needs that you have when you're setting anything from a blog post to a novel. But even that, to be honest, do you really need them all? I mean, I can't tell you how rarely I actually use bold italic on a regular basis, which shockingly is my first type pun of this entire video. But the same goes for whether you need numbers, which there's a few categories of numbers we can discuss another time, and similar for punctuation. A majority of fonts will have the basics for these things, not necessarily all the fancy possibilities, but like we've been talking about, ignore the objective idea of completeness in terms of how many exact characters it has. Pick something that's complete enough to match your needs. So ultimately, the type of text you're designing for, it's 2 puns if you're counting, can help open up possibilities and choices for you. And more often than you think, you can find a creative way around needing like an italic or a bold weight. The League site is an example. It's set in Fanwood, which is one of my favorites, but doesn't have a bold weight. And there were times that I wanted to make something bold, so instead of doing that, I ended up adding a background color to the text instead, which brings it just as much attention without needing to change the font that I wanted to use. It's just one example, but it's a useful one. Limitation breeds creativity. Okay, now don't be overwhelmed by all that detail. Completeness just comes down to 2 simple things. What kind of information are you designing for, and does this font have it? There's uppercase, lowercase, numerals, and punctuation. That's pretty much it. If you figure out what kind of information you're designing around and what it needs, then it's a simple question to answer, so you don't end up investing in buying a really amazing font that's tons of money but won't ultimately suit your needs. It's just kind of planning ahead. So okay, that was a lot to start with. I hope there were a couple tidbits in there that'll help you as you're picking fonts on your own and judging whether you can use them. And there's plenty more to dive into, but at least now we've started talking about some of the qualities of type, how to change your perspective on good versus bad and make it something like, how can I use this? And I'm sure there's still a few intimidating type and design related questions that are still swimming in your head, like, where am I supposed to find fonts? How do I know when and where I can actually use them? How am I supposed to pick the right one for the type of project I'm working on? How do I learn how to pair them and match fonts together so it looks good? Well, you are in luck. I've got another video heading your way in a couple days, and I don't want to give too much away, but considering that there's one question that is literally the most asked question I ever get, I've got a really awesome secret to share with you in the next video. One I discovered long after getting out of art school, and I learned by my own experience working with type over many projects over many years. One kind of simple idea that I've never heard anyone teach, but I think will help you start learning how to pick fonts like a pro. It's a simple mindset shift, but I think you're going to appreciate it. And on top of that, next time, I'm going to give you a little bit more detail about the premium course coming up, which is going straight to people on our email list first. So keep an eye out for that beautiful nugget coming to your inbox in just a couple days. In the meantime, leave us a comment, hit us up on Twitter at the League of, shoot me an email. Let me know what questions you have, either about what we talked about today or in general. So thanks for sticking with me and wanting to learn these new skills. And I will see you in the next video in just a couple days.